Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I was at the apartment in Wenatchee when the last normal day ended. It was a Thursday, bright and cool, and the weather app still worked. The morning news ran a segment about unrest in Seattle. Ambulances backed up at Harborview. A shelter-in-place advisory near Capitol Hill. The anchor's voice kept an upbeat tone that did not match the footage running along the bottom of the screen. By noon, the ticker shifted from traffic to public safety bulletins, and the newsroom switched to a single camera. My work email froze and never refreshed again. When the power blinked for the first time, I shut the laptop and went to the closet where I kept the bins labelled with masking tape. Medical, food, cooking, tools, ammo. It had looked paranoid when I bought all of it. Now it looked like a plan. I tuned the handheld radio to the statewide emergency channels and scanned. The bursts of audio were half words and numbers, call signs and fragments. A dispatcher in King County trying to raise units that no longer answered, a National Weather Service text-to-speech bulletin that repeated the wrong date, a ham operator in Yakima reading notes off paper. I pushed the antenna towards the window and got a cleaner hit on 2 meter, a club repeater still powered by a solar-backed site. A calm voice was reading the situation reports that had been coming in all morning, unusual assaults, then crowd control failures. Then a request for all non-essential personnel to go home. After that, no request, just silence and the clicks of the squelch tail at the end of transmissions. I had promised myself that if things ever broke down in the way we talked about on winter nights, the speculative way you talk when the world still runs, you go to the ridge, 30-odd miles from pavement up service roads that were never worth ploughing. In the best case, it was wasted fuel and a night camping. In the worst case, it was the only place the noise wouldn't follow. I drove the diesel F250 out of town before dusk. The bed was already staged. 8 5-gallon fuel cans with stabilizer mixed and dated. 2 heavy totes of shelf-stable food, rice, pasta, canned chicken, canned vegetables. Another with spare filters, fittings, epoxy, tapes and sealants. A case of water, a pair of 20-watt flexible solar panels rolled in a tube, and the hard case for my HF radio. My rifle in the rear seat, secured in a soft case with a simple cable lock looped to the seat mount. It's a bolt-action .308 with a simple fixed power scope, the type you use in central Washington for deer when the clearings are long. I added the toolbox, a spade, and the camp saw. By habit, I eased a tread depth gauge against the rear tyres, checked the belts, and closed the hood with a clean, flat thump that sounded ridiculous against the rising noise of sirens from the river. The first miles were easy. The sky went a clean blue, then a flat grey as smoke started drifting from the west. Somewhere near Kashmir, the highway slowed and then stopped. People stepped from their cars and looked down the lanes as if a parade would eventually appear. I took an exit and cut through residential streets to a county road that wound into the foothills. The asphalt narrowed to patched chip seal. The houses got older. By the time I reached the first of the forest access points, the last bars on my phone dropped out, and it felt like I was travelling backward in time, one switchback at a time. The Forest Service gate was open. The map in my head, traced from sat shots and county GIS, ran like a track beneath the truck. Forest road spurs branched off like veins. I climbed, easing the truck across washouts. It was fully dark by the time I reached a turn I knew would be blocked by a downed tree that had been there since last spring. It was still there. I shut off the truck and let the silence fill the cab. Then I pulled the handsaw and the headlamp and got to work. An hour later, I nosed through the gap and found the next obstacle. Someone had tried to turn around a small SUV on the narrow road and lodged it against a ditch. The back glass was blown out. On the ground behind it, food wrappers and a torn child's blanket lay in the dust. I put the truck in low, worked around it, watched the side mirror and the cliff edge. and snaked by without scraping. The last mile was always slow. The service route narrowed to a pair of ruts, the centre grass tall enough to brush the oil pan. When I heard the first low roll of sound carry up the valley, distant, like a stadium crowd heard from a hill, I killed the headlights and crept the rest of the way with the windows down. The smell of resin and cedar hit in a wave. I parked below the berm, beside the old landing, and covered the truck with a camouflage tarp I kept rolled under the bed cover. I did it by feel, the way you can do things by feel when you have rehearsed them in your head a dozen times. The logging camp itself was just as I had left it 2 weekends before. A main bunkhouse, a half-collapsed tool shed, the diesel generator shack sunk slightly at one corner, and the rainwater cistern with a long, diagonal crack in the south wall that leaked 2 litres an hour when the head got high. The tin roof of the bunkhouse made a sound when wind pushed across it like a giant sheet of sandpaper. Inside were the things that remained after a place is walked away from in an orderly manner. Iron bunks, a steel wood stove with a cracked fire brick, a bulletin board with the last safety meeting agenda still pinned to it with rusted pushpins, and a drawer of grease pencils that still wrote. I worked on the doors first. The main door's top hinge was loose in punky wood. The screws would no longer bite. I moved the door's hanging point 2 inches down into solid frame and ran longer screws into it. I added a crossbar from a 2x6 and lag bolts with washers big enough to spread the load. Over the windows, I stacked old pallets and screwed them into the frame and the studs inside so they could not be pushed in. It would not stop a determined group, but it would keep out wanderers who pressed at the glass without a plan. On the first night, I did not sleep. I strung a 2-line perimeter from fishing line with small loops of bent wire that would tap tin can chimes if the line moved. I set the hobo stove by the door and warmed soup on it so the bunkhouse never filled with cooking smell. I tuned the HT to scan the local repeaters and switched on the HF set to 40 meters, laying 40 feet of wire out the window to an insulator I hung from a cedar limb. On HF, the world was still talking, but the tone had shifted to lists and requests. A man in Portland reading hospital status, a woman south of Spokane logging check-ins from mobile units, a group of voices that seemed to be military repeating standby for further instruction every 5 minutes. I wrote notes for an hour, then 2, then put down the pencil because there was nothing new to write. At dawn, I walked the camp. The generator was the small one I remembered. An air-cooled diesel rated for around 6 kilowatts at peak, 4 continuous, no nameplate anymore. The mounts were intact, the belts were crazed but not cracked through, and the fuel lines were tight but stiff. The smell in the shed told me there was still diesel in the day tank. I loosened the bleed screws on the injector pump and hand-primed until clean fuel wept at the threads, then tightened and tried a crank. The engine turned and coughed, but didn't catch. I didn't push it. Engines forgive preparation. They don't forgive forcing. I disassembled the air cleaner and banged out the dust, changed the inline filter with one of the spares from my bin. It wasn't a match, but a universal housing adapter fixed that. And tried again. This time, it started, wobbled, and settled into a steady tone that felt like someone else in the camp was working with me. I shut it down after a few minutes to save fuel. I would only run it when it made sense, and the sound would not call anything in from the valley. The cistern had always been the weak point. A cold snap years ago had been enough to open a long hairline in the south wall. I had brought a bucket of hydraulic cement powder and a cartridge of urethane sealant. I scrubbed the crack with a wire brush, flushed it, and chased it with the urethane. The knife line smoothed and shone black. When it skinned over, I mixed the cement and pressed it in with a trowel. A fix like that never lasts forever, but it buys time. I reconnected the rain gutters from the bunkhouse roof to the inflow and cleaned the screen of needles. On the outlet, I added a short run of PVC to seat a simple sand and charcoal filter I had assembled the last time I was up. It was nothing special. A layer of pea gravel, a layer of washed sand, a layer of activated charcoal from a pair of aquarium canisters, and a final cloth sock. I added a ceramic gravity filter inside the bunkhouse for drinking water. You can live with some sediment in the washing bucket. You can't live with a gut bug when you're alone. That morning, I also made the place quiet. I took the hinges off every loose swinging sheet of tin and pinned them down with screws so the wind couldn't make them talk. I pulled the old nails from a pile of warped boards and put the nails in a jar so I would not step on one and limp for a week. I swept glass into a corner where it would stay. I set a workbench near the door where the light was good, and I laid out tools in a way that made sense. A row of wrenches by size, drivers, tapes, wire, tape measures, a clamp lamp with a bulb I could plug in when I had the generator running. When you are alone, order is safety. You don't waste time looking for the one socket that fits when the sound outside the wall is not wind. By the middle of day 3, I heard the first of them. You can tell the difference between an elk moving in brush and people who have forgotten how to move quietly. There is a rhythmic break that catches like a bad bearing. I flattened against the inside wall by the window slit and watched the roadbed through a seam between the boarded slats. One figure, then a second, then a third, moving slow along the road like they were still in a line at a festival. Their clothes were wrong for the ridge. Soft shoes, city jackets, no packs. The first one turned its head like it had caught a sound, and the second drifted into the first without correcting course, as if the idea of personal space had gone away with everything else. I waited. They passed. One paused near the walker line I had set with the tins. A toe took the line, and the cans bumped. The figure cocked its head, took 2 steps toward the sound, stood 6 inches from my wall as if listening to the wood grain, then moved along. I counted to 100 before I breathed in more than a sip. From that point, I cut lights at night to nothing. I cooked on the hobo stove outdoors and then cleaned with hot water and a few drops of bleach so the scent didn't build up in any one place that would draw attention. I used the generator only during midday when wind and the white noise of insects would cover it. I worked in a rotation, maintained the camp, improved the fortifications, run radio checks, inventory, train. Training meant simple drills. Lock and unlock with eyes closed. Shoulder the rifle and sweep from window slit to door, safety on. Pack the small ruck and run to the truck and back in a minute while staying off lines and avoiding the noisemaker pins I had set in the ground. It was a one-man routine, and it kept me from believing the camp's walls would do the work of making me safe. On the 4th day, I heard a voice where there should have been none. It was a woman's, low, trying to sound neutral, the way you do when you don't want to trigger anything or anyone. Hello at the cabin. I'm coming up slow. I'm alone. I put my left eye to the slit and saw her in the road, hands out, a rifle slung on her back, a tan uniform shirt tied around her waist by the sleeves. She kept her hands visible the whole time as she approached, stopping at the first line of the perimeter. "My name is Maya," she said. "I'm a ranger." She nodded toward the shoulder patch rolled in her pack strap. "I'm not asking to come in. I'm asking for water." I kept the rifle at low ready and moved to the door. I cracked it and passed out a full 1-liter bottle, not the camp cup. She drank 4 swallows, closed the bottle, and took a step sideways away from the door. "You're alone?" I asked. "Yes," she said, and then added, "I was with a group. They moved down slope toward houses. I don't think that was a smart move. I kept to the timber line. I saw your truck tarp. You stretched it clean. That's how I knew someone with a plan was here." We settled the rules at the door, the way you do when you don't know if the thing that ruins you is outside or the person asking to come in. I said no lights after dark, no voices above a murmur, a watch rotation, even if there were only 2 of us, no food waste near the structure, and a mask rule if either of us felt unwell. I still held on to the old habits that had been drilled into us during other outbreaks. She agreed without a face or a sigh. That made me trust her more than the uniform on the strap. She slept in the tool shed the first night by choice. "You've fortified that place for one," she said, nodding at the bunkhouse. "I can make this work." In the morning, she'd already walked the perimeter and adjusted 3 of my lines to better angles. "These are good," she said. I'd add 2 more on the east side where the drainage would funnel feet. When she spoke of the infected, she did not use words meant to make things feel smaller. She used the same vocabulary you use for hazards on a trail map. They drift, she said. They follow sound more than sight. They stack up on obstacles if something interests them. Her voice carried no drama, and for a few hours I felt less alone. Liam arrived a week later. He came up the road, listing to one side as if one leg hurt, leaning against a stake he had pulled from somewhere. He had the look of a working man at the edge of collapse. Hands scarred, nails old with oil, beard coming in at an uneven pace, eyes not faded but overused. He saw the lines and stopped short. "Don't trip those," he said, mostly to himself, and then raised both hands and called up, "I'm looking for work and a place that isn't a parking lot. I have skills and I don't need much to eat if the food's simple." I did not open the door. I asked him to turn around. I asked him to lift his shirt. He did as asked. The bruising on his left side matched a fall, not a fight. He winced, but did not make a noise when I asked him to squat and stand. "What do you do?" I asked. "I drove a truck," he said, "and I fix the things that keep trucks from dying when the maintenance plan was prey." We let him into the yard and then into the shed. We kept distance for the day. I gave him a bowl of broth, and he ate it slow, as if his stomach had gotten used to small portions. When night came, he slept without snoring, a skill I did not know how to value until it mattered. It turned out Liam was not a liar. On the second day, he rebuilt the carb on the small backup gasoline generator I had written off as junk. On the third, he pulled the alternator off a dead ATV we had found down the road and fabricated a bracket to belt drive it from a small engine so we could charge batteries without running the big diesel. He looked happiest when a system came back to life. Maya moved through the timber like she had been born with a measure of the land in her foot bones. She returned with small game without making the forest angry. She knew how to cook the basics without leaving scent, and she cut the bunks down to remove the rotten boards and rebraced them so you could sleep without a spring poking you awake. We set a watch schedule, 2 hours on, 4 off, rotating. At night, we wore red lenses so our pupils would not open to saucer size, and then fight to close again if we needed to hit a light for a second. No one's phone made a sound, ever. I put the HT on a scan of our chosen simplex channel and the 2 local repeaters that still pinged, and laid it on a shelf we could reach in the dark without fumbling. I showed them the maps I had printed, the drainages, the lines, the logging spurs, and we ran a few short rehearsals. Pack up, move quiet, rendezvous at the truck, then move to the second rally point if the truck was compromised. It wasn't a militia camp or a movie. It was 3 people trying to make a small place into something the wind could pass over without stopping. We lasted 3 weeks before the world remembered us. It started as a faint mechanical sound that did not fit the forest. The rhythm was wrong for a tractor, too smooth for a side-by-side, lacking the high whine of a 2-stroke. I went to the slit with the binoculars and found the glint of glass far down the valley. A vehicle eased into view, then another, then a third. 3 pickups travelled a line that was not a road, but had seen tyres. They paused where the small SUV had blocked the road weeks earlier, and men climbed out and moved it, fast, practiced, careful with their hands the way people are when they are used to tools that bite back. They wore mismatched gear, nothing uniform beyond an economy of motion. The lead truck had a welded rack on the front, a sheet of steel set like a plough. All 3 carried fuel cans ratchet strapped in the bed, and everything that could clank had been taped. When they cleared the SUV and started forward again, I said out loud what the others were already thinking. They didn't just happen on this road, they followed a map. Maya lifted her chin toward the truck tarp I had stretched the first night. Or a glint, she said, or a man with a bad idea. It was unfair to look at Liam as I said it, but I did. He did not take offense. He reached into his pack and pulled out the GPS. "This used to be company gear," he said. "It was off. I can't prove that it didn't talk anyway." He dropped it on the workbench and slid it toward me with 2 fingers. "If I brought them here, I brought them by accident. I'll help push them away on purpose. We did not have a defensive wall or a tower with a loud name. We had pine, cable, and gravity. We made those into what we needed. The old logging cables were coiled by the landing, grey with age, but not rotted. The eyes were intact. The strands still held. We dragged them across the access road and wrapped them around 2 stout cedars on either side, chest high on a standing man. We tightened them with the come-along until they sang when plucked. 2 more lines went lower, set to catch the undercarriage of something heavy and drag it to a stop without breaking it in half. The idea was not to create a fortress. The idea was to turn momentum into a pause and a pause into doubt. Across the main approach, we rolled 4 empty 55-gallon drums, half full of water, plugged and sealed, then set them in shallow pits with a wedge so they would rest and then roll when released. We ran a trip line that would pull the wedge free if you drove over it too fast. We stacked old pallets and wet them with water from the cistern and ran a rope that would pull a blanket of tarp over them to make a barrier if we needed to. On the corners, we staged 2 marine flares in the tube. You never want to start a forest fire, not for any reason, but you also want to control the one you might need to start. We cleared 30 feet of duff around the camp structures with rakes and shovels, so nothing would carry flame to the walls if the perimeter burned. Maya took that section personally, moving the tool back and forth down to mineral soil, then patting it like a baker finishing a loaf. Near noon, the trucks reached the first bend where the road rose. They stopped. I watched 6 men climb down and walk the slope in a line like they had worked together before all of this. They didn't shout. They pointed. They moved one at a time around the trucks and under, looking for lines. One carried bolt cutters. He trimmed my tin can alarm from the brush and held it up between finger and thumb, as if showing an audience a coin he had palmed. He looked up in the direction of the bunkhouse then, as if the face behind the wood was visible. He was young and cocky and moved like the world had taught him that he was fast. He smiled a little and tucked the can into his back pocket. The men returned to the trucks. The lead driver tested the bumper against the road, loading the suspension, then released. It was the gentle touch of a man who had driven things in hard places. They came up slower after that. The first cable caught the plough rack and squealed, and the driver stopped and reversed with a practiced hand, easing tension without snapping the set. He climbed out and studied it, and then backed the truck down and off to the side. The second truck came forward. The cutter moved in and took the cable with a fast bite of the tool. The cable snapped back and cut a line in the bark of a tree. The men laughed the way you do when a trick fails and it feeds the part of you that likes winning. They rolled forward. The barrels wobbled in their cradles and then went. 2 rolled, 1 hung, 1 jammed, and then dropped into the ditch where it did nothing. It wasn't the clean chain reaction I had drawn in my head, but it did what mattered. It forced them to stop in a section where the sound would travel. The first of the infected came at the sound of the truck horns. They appeared between trees and along the cut banks, the way water finds low places. One hit the side of the truck and slid along it, hands skittering on paint. Another walked into the back wheel and stood there, hands on the sheet metal, as if trying to remember how to pull. The men did not panic. The driver put the bumper against the rolling drum and pushed it back into the road like it was a snowball. One of the others stepped forward with a length of pipe and knocked an infected aside with a move that had no flourish and all purpose. He did not hit again. He stepped back to his spot and looked at the tree line. They had done this before. I did not fire. Maya did not fire. Even Liam did not whisper the word. We waited. If they decided to leave, we would not argue with the result. They did not leave. They started to move again when the road ahead looked clear, then stopped when the road ahead showed the speed bump of my pallets under the tarp. That was the moment we needed. A man moved forward to tug the tarp, exactly as I hoped. He bent, and I cracked the flare and sent it in a clean arc to the edge of the tarp's fold. The plastic caught with a low whoosh. The fire held to the tarp and burned the plastic like a fuse. The infected around the trucks flinched at the light and turned their heads. But the fire was small and deliberate, and the air around it had been cleared. It did not run. The men cursed then, and the curses carried that hungry edge that told me what they were here for wasn't a place to rest, but the fuel and the generator they had seen from a drone or a ridgeline. They wanted the heart of the camp and what it could do for their plans, not the walls. That made them dangerous in a way a hungry man isn't. The flare signaled something else. We knew the sound would pull more infected up the road and from the sides. The men knew it too. Their choice was now or later, and they chose now. The second and third trucks moved up to the cable and pushed together. The cable snapped from the tree and lashed the ditch. The trucks took the grade like old draft horses hitting a trace chain. They had power and traction, and the men had practiced. They would be on us in minutes. Back, I said. Back now. Liam caught the handle of the diesel shed and threw it closed. Maya grabbed the radio case and slung it under her arm. We didn't lock the bunkhouse or fold the blankets or do any of the human things people do to keep pretend control when control is over. We dropped from the back of the cabin and moved along the drainage we had scouted our first week together. It ran like a shallow half pipe down slope through ferns and deadfall. We slid more than we walked. Behind us, the trucks reached the open, and the men poured from them with the same measured pace they had used on the road. They climbed the stairs to the bunkhouse and peeled boards like labels. The sound of wood pulled from nail heads rang in the trees. I felt a small pain in my ribs that had nothing to do with the body and everything to do with the work we had put into making something hold. I heard the first shots then, but they were not ours. One of the men fired to drop an infected that had followed the sound up the road and gotten too close, and another fired to discourage the three that had arrived beside the generator shed and were mindlessly pushing at the metal wall. Every shot was at a target that presented itself, not a signal to scare anything. The shots did what shots do. The forest woke up. We reached the bend where the drainage forked and took the left branch that led to the truck. We stayed low and listened. The men had found the fuel. I could tell by the metallic clinks and the call for a siphon. In the same breath, I could tell they had found the trap we had mostly built to scare ourselves. The barrel rack that would roll 2 drums at a push. It didn't hit anyone. It banged into a truck and rang like a bell. Then more infected arrived and the balance changed. When a dozen drift in, men who know what they are doing work the edges and keep space open and keep moving. When 30 arrive, the best thing to do is move out. When 50 find you in the tight corners of a small camp, the right choice is never to hold the center. The men didn't hold. They backed to the trucks and started to go the way they came. But the infected came from the way they came as well, drawn by the earlier noise. It was a sandwich made of bad choices and steel. Go, Maya said to me and Liam. She was already moving up the side slope toward a game trail we had marked with 2 small stones and a strip of cloth at knee height. I followed. Behind us, Liam swore low through his teeth as his left side complained. He didn't ask to stop. We moved in a crouch for the next 5 minutes and then in a walk for 10 more. We didn't speak. We didn't look back because looking back would give the sounds a face, and faces are persuasive. We stopped at the truck. The tarp was still where I had stretched it that first night, and that seemed like a good sign. We dug in, pulled it off, and I slid behind the wheel. The key turned and the engine caught with a deep, even tone. That is why you buy a diesel when you mean business. I let it idle. I didn't put it in gear. We had agreed that if we ever left fast, we left with a plan. You can drive up a problem, and then you have to choose between forward into worse or backward into confusion. The better move was sideways and up. The fire lookout tower was our sideways and up. It sat 2 ridges over, on a knuckle of granite with a road that had been closed with boulders after the old budget cuts. It was not a secret, but it was out of the line of travel for people who follow maps without understanding how contour lines decide where a foot can go. We drove the truck along the old spur and then onto a track that was not a road but had once been good enough for a skidder. Twice I had to stop, get out, and move small logs or rocks to get clearance. Once we all had to get out, and stack flat stones into a rough ramp to keep the rear differential from hanging. I could feel the torque rise and fall through the seat and the wheel, the engine complaining at low speed like a working man expected to do more than one job. At the base of the tower, I parked under the tree line, nose out, and shut down. We listened. The valley made a sound like a stadium again, then went quiet again. The tower stood above us, 4 legs, cross-braced, leading to a square that sat just at the level where wind always finds a way through. The stairs were old, but intact. I went first, then Maya, then Liam, his jaw set. At the top, the door was locked with a padlock someone had installed in a better era. I cut it with the bolt cutters and pocketed the shank. Inside, it smelled of dust, paper, and mouse. The map table stood in the centre, the firefinder still mounted, its glass ring lined with degrees and the crosshair still true. The windows were dirty, but the view was honest. The world wasn't gone, it was simply rearranged. We set up a new kind of camp. It was higher, more exposed to wind, but had sight in all directions. We could see the road where the trucks had come. A smear of smoke, thin, low, drifting south, marked our old camp. I looked at it without blinking until my eyes watered. Then I worked. The tower had a small photovoltaic panel mounted on a rail that had once been enough to run a light bulb and a radio to talk to a dispatcher about lightning strikes. I cleaned it with water and a rag and traced the wiring to an old charge regulator. The old battery in the corner was dead as a joke. I pulled the 2 deep cycle batteries from the truck and paralleled them for now, making sure the connections were tight and my polarity was right, then tested with a small lamp. It lit. We would not run the panel into the batteries in an uncontrolled way. The old regulator was simple but good enough. It did not need an app or a password or a cloud. It needed wires that did not corrode and a human who could read a dial. Maya inventoried the tower like a supply officer. There were notebooks, pencils, a box of old topo maps, a pair of binoculars that were fungus-free, a metal locker with a camp stove, and 4 green fuel canisters that gurgled when shaken. There was a small first aid kit with nothing interesting left inside. There was a broom. You would be surprised how useful a broom is when you're trying to make a place feel like a place again. Liam stretched on the floor to work his leg, then stood and walked a loop. "We can put tarps over the windward windows on grommets," he said, "so we can pin them down fast if the weather turns. We can hang one under the eaves to catch rain and run it into a barrel. We can rig the radio better here. Higher is always better for radio." He pointed at the corners. "And we can drill small holes and run bolts, so if someone pulls at the frames, they don't come off in one shot." That night, we ate rice and canned chicken with salt, and called it the first good meal of the new place. We took watches, but they felt different here. Instead of staring at wood grain by a slit, you stood by a window and watched dark plumes drift above distant trees, and tried to assign meaning to every flicker. I set up the HF radio again, running a wire out the window and down the leg of the tower, then along a branch line to a tree. I tuned 40 meters and listened. The band felt thinner, fewer voices. The ones that were still there sounded tired and certain of their tiredness. I heard a net control in Boise calling for check-ins by county and getting one reply every 3 minutes. I heard a man in British Columbia reading road closures like a prayer. I listened past midnight. Then I heard something that did not fit the pattern. It was a voice reading coordinates the way a pilot reads them when a controller needs accuracy and clarity more than speed. The voice did not say what the coordinates were for. It read them twice, then repeated a phrase, Fort Argo. I wrote them down in block numbers in the notebook we had designated as the new log. The next morning, we converted the tower from a lookout to a home. We did small, ordinary things that become the difference between existing and living. We built shelves from old boards and stacked cans by type and date. We hung a line and washed socks. We set a bucket under the eaves and measured how much water a drizzle gave us in an hour and did the math for a day. We set the radios to a routine. I called at set times, then listened for set times. If we heard nothing, We did it again at the next time. A plan is a way to survive the minutes when your head wants to invent other versions of what you ought to do. On the third day at the tower, Maya found the old cache. It was not a cache in the romantic sense. It was simply a locker under the floorboards with a false bottom. Inside was a roll of maps with penciled notes in neat hand, range headings, typical wind directions by month, the names of old lookouts with phone numbers that no longer mattered but felt like history in ink. There was also a field notebook with 2 pages of radio frequencies written in pencil and a title at the top. Skywarn NWS Forest Nets, State EOC. Many were now dead air. A few still carried life. We circled those and added the times we had heard activity. On the 5th day, a helicopter flew the valley. It was an old Bell, the kind you still see in utility work and search and rescue, with a paint job that had once been a company colour and now was a dull patchwork. It flew low along the river and then up the spur road that passed within a mile of the tower. It did not see the truck in the trees below us, or did not care. We watched as it turned once over our old camp, hovered for a long minute and then pivoted south. The wind from its rotors reached us a minute later and lifted dust from the deck in a spiral. We did not wave. If you wave now, you are either signalling to something you are sure you want or advertising to something you are not sure about at all. We were not sure about a helicopter with a paint job that was now more primer than brand. Liam's leg improved. He walked the stairs without grabbing the rail by the 2nd week. He took up the routine of maintaining the batteries and the generator we rarely dared to run. He had a way of tapping a wrench against a bolt head and hearing if a thread was thinking about backing off. He rewired the old tower light to a DC bulb so we could have a dim glow at the center of the room that would not silhouette us against the glass. Small good light is a gift when the dark is not a blanket, but a substance you push back against. Maya mapped the land we could now see with the view that the old firefinder gave us. She called out headings and I wrote them on the map with a pencil in clean lines. We logged smoke plumes and their times. We logged movements that could be people. We logged a thing that travelled along a ridgeline at the same time every day for 4 days in a row. A small group or a single person who had a reason to walk at a certain hour. We did not know what that reason was. We did not go to find out. We did not add mysteries lightly. Birds returned. The loud mechanical voices in the valley got rarer. Night brought sound that was less busy and more occasional. Once we heard a dog. It barked the way a dog barks when it is looking for its person and the person is not there. The sound travelled up the slope and turned my spine into a long wire. It was gone by morning. I wrote more in the log than I spoke out loud. Some entries were technical, battery voltages morning and evening, charge current, state of the cistern, how many litres the tarp line caught in a half hour of steady rain. Some were fragments. A dream about the bunkhouse where everything was in the wrong place by just a little, and the wrongness felt like an electrical buzz. A note about how long it took to boil beans at this elevation compared to Wenatchee. A simple number, 3. How many people we still were. On a morning when a cold fog sat below us like a lake, we heard tyres on rock. The sound came from the spur below. I put the binoculars on that section and found a vehicle. It was not the 3 trucks. It was a single 4-door with a cargo rack and a person on the roof with binoculars. They were scanning the slopes, sweeping back and forth, methodical. The vehicle stopped, idled for a minute, then shut down. 3 people climbed out and stretched. They stood in a small circle for a minute, the way people do when they're deciding who will speak first. Then they started up the trail toward the tower with their hands empty and visible. We did not hide. We did not expose ourselves. We stood in the shadow of the windows and watched. At 50 yards, the lead person called up. "We see you," she said. "We're not a problem. We're looking for a radio." I looked at Maya. She looked at me, and then at the HF set that sat like a grey brick on the map table. I put a hand on the set as if it were a pet, and we both smiled at the impulse. "What for?" I called down. The woman shaded her eyes with her palm and called back. There's a broadcast at set times, it's coordinates. We can't raise anything on VHF that sounds like a plan. We thought this would be the kind of place where people who know about radios went. We're trying to figure out if the broadcast is a trap or a way out. Heard it, I said. We wrote the numbers. There was a minute of stillness. Then the woman said, "Can we talk from here?" I said, "Yes." We had conversations at a distance for an hour. Names first. Her name was Sharon. The man to her left was named Victor. The other person was a teenager named Drew. They were from Leavenworth. They had held in a vacation rental with friends until the supplies ran low. And then the drift of the infected up the canyon had made staying feel like holding breath underwater. They had a truck with a half tank. They had water and some food. They had a camp stove that would last 2 more meals. They had a map marked with a circle around a lake to the east that they thought might have cabins to search. They had heard the same coordinates we had on a road trip earlier in the week, and that had changed their direction from a circle to a line. They had been hoping someone higher would have a stronger radio to hear more than we had heard. They were honest about the fact that if we had fuel we didn't want to share, they would still thank us for information that changed their odds. We told them what we knew. The coordinates plotted offshore. Not far offshore, but not a swim. There were small islands in that direction that had resorts and old infrastructure. Fort Argo meant nothing to me until I thought of the resorts in the San Juan Islands that had been sold as eco-retreats with solar and battery and water catchment systems that would look like a sanctuary in a flyer. They would also look like a promise to people who had told their families they would find a place that still worked. Sharon asked the right question at the end. If you were us, would you go there? I did not answer fast. She waited and added, "And if you were you, would you leave this tower?" "If I were you," I said, "I would choose a direction and commit. Sideways motion burns fuel and time. Those coordinates are a good direction because they end at a narrow place. Either it's something or it's not. But you will have an answer in days, not weeks. And if it's nothing, the water between you and the mainland is a defensive line that works for and against you. So you should carry what you need to leave if the answer is the wrong one." "And if you were you?" Sharon asked. "If I were me," I said, "I would listen 3 more days for the broadcast and see if the message changes. If it does not, I would leave. The tower is safe against wandering problems. It is not safe against planned problems. Planned problems have a way of finding high places. The 3 trucks that found our camp can find anything if it shines." Sharon nodded, then asked if we had water to spare. We lowered 2 bottles on a rope. They left a sack with 4 cans and a spare butane cylinder, and it felt like a fair trade. Before they walked back to the truck, the teenager looked up and said, "If you go that way, and you see a windmill with a red tail vane and a blue sled under it, there's a dog there. He's friendly. He chased us for a while and then stopped. He said it like information, not a plea, but it sat in my head with a weight that felt larger than the words." 3 days later, the broadcast was the same. The numbers did not jump. The voice read them at the same times and did not add a word. We packed. We did it deliberately, the way you do before a trip that matters. We set aside sentiment. The tower had given us perspective. We wrote the log's last page, logged the date and the hour we were leaving, and put the notebook in the drawer where someone else, if there was anyone else, would look. We put the dead battery and the old regulator in the corner with a simple drawing of how the wires went. If a person had enough knowledge to make it up the stairs and open the drawer, they would understand the drawing and maybe find something they could use. We loaded the truck with the bins, heavier on fuel than on things that would be easy to find in any small town. We secured the radio in the cab and rigged the HF wire for temporary use with a quick disconnect on the truck bed, so we could throw a line up and get a signal in a field without building a camp. We left the tower better than we found it. We left it with the broom leaned by the door, bristles up so they would not curve. Before we pulled away, I climbed the stairs one more time and looked out over the valley. Smoke rose in the direction of the old camp. The trucks were gone. The sound was the old sound again, wind and birds. and a woodpecker somewhere to the north tapping a beat on a dead snag. It felt like normal, if normal were reconceived as a layer you can pull up like a blanket and find holes. We drove out without drama. The ruts felt familiar under the tyres. We passed the bend where my barriers had made a difference for 10 minutes that felt like an hour. The barrels lay in the ditch, empty now. A few dents added to their surfaces like the rings on a tree. The pallets were a loose scatter of ash and charcoal. The bunkhouse roof had fallen in. The generator shed still stood. I hoped that was because the men had not known what to do with it, not because they had filled their cans from the day tank and then left without turning off the valve. We reached the county road by early afternoon, and then the highway. The highway did not look like it had on my way up. It had the look of a place where motion had stopped and people had left objects where they were, and then walked in lines that later broke apart. We threaded the truck along the shoulder and down into the median and around. A horse grazed on the verge by the eastbound lanes, rope trailing, saddle battered. The sky to the west carried a tint like paper ash. We moved east. Our target was the idea of a marina, a boat ramp, a place where people put things into water on weekends. When we reached the Columbia, it opened like a corridor. The boat launches were as I had imagined. The first one had a rental building with a metal shutter. The shutter was down and locked. The second had a rack of kayaks no good to us. The third had a small fishing boat on a trailer with a flat tire and a one-cylinder outboard that would push it at 5 knots on a good day. We found a pump, put air in the tire, and waited. It held. We hitched it to the truck and pulled it to a flat spot near the water and began to audit the parts. Fuel line, tank, spark plug, impeller, shear pin, a coil of line, a pair of paddles. It was not a boat for the Sound and the islands. It was a step. We needed 1 or 2 more steps before the crossing. There would be locks and lines and stretches that were not safe to run. We could cut across on forest roads and reach the coast sooner and find a marina with a boat that fit. But those roads would pass through towns that had shrunk into hard shells. We did not need encounters. We needed a path that kept us away from people and pulled us toward a place that had posted coordinates on a frequency that had not died. That night, we camped by the river and took watches again, because that routine was now a part of our bones. I lay on my side on the truck bed, looking up at a slice of sky I could see past the canopy, and thought of the dog under the windmill with the red tail vein. It was not a romance thought. It was the kind of simple calculation you make when it occurs to you that living things keep other living things oriented. If we passed the windmill and the dog was there, and he was in a state where he wanted to get in the truck, and there was no one else whose claim outranked ours, we would add a 4th to our 3. I did not say it out loud. I did not have to. In the morning, when we brewed coffee on the little stove, Maya mentioned she had set aside a can of meat in a bowl, and Liam had a length of paracord looped in his pocket. 2 days later, we found the windmill. The vein was faded now, but the red still showed where the sun had not hit. The blue sled was half pushed under a fir to keep weather off. The dog came out of the shadow and looked at us with focus and then doubt, as if passing whether we were the people he wanted us to be. He did not bark. He stood. Maya crouched and kept her hands loose. The dog moved forward in steps. When he was close enough to sniff her sleeve, he did. Then he put his weight against her leg like a request. She scratched his side, below the ribs where the fur is thick. She said, without looking up, "There's your yes." And we all pretended not to feel the sudden weight in our throats. We checked for tags and found nothing. We walked the windmill circle and called out and got no answer. We left a note on a sheet of paper in a Ziploc bag pinned under a rock. "We found your dog at this location on this date. We will care for him. If you see this and want him back, we are tracking toward the posted coordinates called Fort Argo." We drove west. The coastline was not empty, but it was less full than the places east. We kept to the edges and we made choices based on simple rules. Avoid traffic jams, avoid crowds, choose the second best boat instead of the best, when the best comes with eyes watching the same thing. At a small marina, that a different world would have called a working harbour, we found what we needed. An older aluminum skiff with a 40 horsepower outboard and enough beam to carry weight without twitching in the chop. A spare prop in a locker, a pair of life jackets, a length of chain, an anchor the size of a good rock. The keys were in the switch because the last person who used it had expected to return by noon. We filled the built-in tank and added 2 cans to the bow and balanced the weight and strapped everything down. We loaded the dog like we had rehearsed it in our heads. Maya first, then the dog, then me and Liam with the last of the totes. I threw the line to Liam and he cast off with a quiet flick that told me more about his life before than anything he had said. As we idled clear of the marina, a sound from the harbour entrance drew our eyes. Another boat turning in, the operator scanning, an orange life preserver bumping the side. We did not wave, we did not slow. We eased the throttle and slid out, nose into the swell, eyes on the channel markers, minds on the coordinates written in a notebook that now felt like a map to something that could change our definition of distance. The outboard's tone settled to a steady working note at 3/4 throttle. The bow lifted just enough to feel like a decision. The dog put his front paws on the seat and his chin on the gunnel and watched the line of the horizon with interest and then with contentment, like the sound and the motion solved a problem he had not known how to solve himself. I tuned the handheld to the broadcast time. It came on exactly when it always had. The same voice, the same numbers, no promise, no threat, a line on water and an idea called Fort Argo at the end of it. "Hold this line," I said, pointing past the bow, and we did. We reached a cluster of low islands by late afternoon and cut power in the lee of a rocky point where kelp streamed like the slow hair of something asleep. The world looked like it does when the tourist brochures are true, and the text beside the photo would say words like restorative and quiet. There were gulls and the slap of small waves against rock, and the smell of brine that pushes every other smell out of your head. There was also a sign on a post that had been painted with the name of a resort, and another sign below it that said closed, and below that, a hand-painted sign that said, "Keep moving," in a block print that did not seem threatening as much as it seemed like advice. We moved along the point and around the headland and into a small bay. There was a dock. There were lights strung above the dock that did not shine. There was a boat with no one in it. There was the sound of a generator somewhere you could not see. You can tell the difference between a small diesel and a gasoline generator, even over water. The diesel makes a deeper note, steadier, less frantic. The sound we heard was diesel, and it carried the same comfort for me that the generator at the camp had carried on the first day. A voice spoke over a loudhailer, not aggressive, not the kind of amplified voice that tries to make you jump. "Boat in the bay," it said. "Slow to idle. Keep your hands visible. If you are not hostile, you will be told where to tie up." We did exactly as told. A person in a rain shell with a fluorescent stripe stepped into view on the dock. They had a radio on their shoulder and a clipboard the way a person working a loading dock would have had a clipboard during a delivery. It felt organized, and that felt like relief under the ribs where the body carries most of its tension. "State your names," the person called without drama. We did. "How many are you?" 3 plus a dog. "Any injuries?" "A healing leg." "Any symptoms?" "No." "Any other boats behind you?" "No." There was a pause, and then the person said, "Approach the second slip. A person in a green jacket will take your line." The person in the green jacket did. He tied us off with 3 clean wraps and a half hitch that made me feel a small, irrational pride. People who can tie a proper hitch do not invent a lot of other problems for themselves. He looked us over, the way you look over equipment before you sign for it. Then he smiled, with a small, contained relief that made him look like a child for the space of a blink. "Welcome," he said, and the word felt like a tool being handed across a bench. Useful, with a purpose. We went ashore. We stepped onto the dock without stumbling. The dog shook water from his coat and then sat and looked into the eyes of the person in the green jacket, as if asking the single direct question that dogs ask. Are you one of us? The person reached down and scratched his head, and the dog's ears went back the way ears do when the question is answered to satisfaction. A woman approached with a small kit and a thermometer and the set of questions that had been the litany of the last 2 years of another kind of crisis. She asked them without condescension, and she wrote her answers without missing a beat. She looked at the rifle case and then at me. "We have a weapons check procedure," she said, and then added, "We prefer to store them and issue checks back out by duty roster, but we know not everyone is ready for that on day one. Let's talk about it after you've eaten." She said it like a person inviting you to a conversation about a work schedule, and not like a person discussing a line between safety and trust, and that did more for my heart rate than any affirmation she could have offered. We were led along the dock to a courtyard where tables were set with real plates, and the smell of food that was not a can filled the air. People ate in quiet, not because they were afraid to talk, but because when your body is still catching up, your mouth gives the energy to swallowing. As we walked, I saw that the lights did work in a section near the main building. A line of panels sat on the roof at a tilt adjusted for latitude. A line of batteries, lithium, the kind with the safe chemistry, sat inside a cage with a lock. The cables ran clean, and the combiner box looked like a professional had labelled it, not a hobbyist with a paint pen. The generator sound came from a building with louvers and a welded exhaust line. There was no spare hose lying in the gravel. There was no spill under the day tank. If someone had rushed this, they had done it with a checklist in hand. We were given bowls, and we ate, and we breathed like people land after a long swim. No one asked us for a speech. No one asked us to tell our story. A person at the end of the table told a joke about coffee being a renewable resource, and we managed the kind of laugh that is the opposite of explosion. It was the small release kind, the kind that vents pressure and lets you keep going. After the meal, the person with the clipboard found us again. "There's an orientation at sunset," she said. "There's one at sunrise too. Pick one. It's the same content. It explains how we do this." She looked at me when she said how we do this, and I realized I had been waiting to be told what this was. At sunset, we stood in a circle with 8 other new arrivals and listened. The voice on the loudhailer was now the voice in front of us. It belonged to a person named Helena who had worked in facilities management for a tech company that will not be needed again. She spoke plainly without selling anything. "This is a place we built to get through the first months unbroken," she said. "We are not the government. We are not a cult. We are a group of people who had keys and tools in the same place on the same day and decided to select a plan that did not end at a pile of plastic wrappers and arguments." She pointed behind her at the building with the louvers. "Power is from solar and diesel. We use it for essentials, water pumping, refrigeration, communications, lights for working. We do not use it for comfort. We do not turn on heaters for a room if a sweater will do. We do not run hairdryers. We do not charge things we do not need for work. Food is simple. Work is assigned by skill and rotated so no one gets ground down. Security is quiet. You will not see uniforms because we do not draw attention that way. But there is a plan, and there are posts, and there is a rotation, and there are rules about light at night and sound during hours when sound travels far. If you want to stay, you can. If you want to rest and leave, we will not hold you. If you want to bring others, we will plan for that with you, not after you arrive." She looked around the circle and then at me specifically and said, "At certain hours, there is a broadcast on a band you have probably found. It reads coordinates. Those coordinates are here. We debated doing that. We decided to do that because we do not own anything that isn't better, with more hands and more brains working on it. We cannot gather everyone. We can gather enough to make it less likely that the wrong people gather it for us." I nodded, and the motion carried weight. The last line of the plan I had written in the tower had read, "Find a place where a plan exists. You can write hope in a notebook. It looks like a word. But what you want is not a word. What you want is a building with louvers, a battery bank properly caged, a woman with a clipboard and the tone of someone who has filled out maintenance logs and argued about fan belts in a loading dock at 6 a.m. You want a place that turns hope into a schedule. So, that night, I lay on a mat in a room we had been assigned by a person whose job title was now beds, and I listened to the building. I heard a hum that was the inverter stepping DC up to AC. I heard a relay click as a charge controller did its thing. I heard the wind. I heard the dogs breathing. I wrote the last entry of the day in the small notebook I still kept at hand and put a period at the end of the line. In the morning, there would be duties and conversations and an inventory of what we had brought that was now the group's and what we would keep for those parts of the plan that needed a private resource. There would be trust to build and adjustments to make and a place to fit the skills we carried, each of us like a wrench of a different size in a role. There would be trips back to the mainland because the world does not stop at the water's edge, and because some problems are solved by facing them in the place where they exist, instead of trying to outsit them somewhere pretty. In the morning, there would also still be a radio check. I put the notebook under my jacket and slept for the first time without the feeling that the wall next to me was thinner than I needed it to be. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.